Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. And my guest today is Dr. Matthew Hill. He's a neuroscientist who really focuses on endocannabinoids. I've actually seen Dr. Matthew Hill present before, and I can tell you that whenever I'm there, all the attendees really perk their ears up whenever he's speaking. So I'm really excited to have him on the show today. And you may know this already, but he was also recently featured on Andrew Huberman's podcast. So, Dr. Matthew Hill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you're a neuroscientist, but maybe you could just give the audience just a little bit of a brief background about yourself and just let them know what you actually study.
Yeah, so I study the endocannabinoid system, which is the kind of biological system in the brain and body that is what THC acts on and exerts its effects on the brain and body. It's got like a couple of receptors that THC acts on. Some are in the brain, some are on the immune cells. We call these cannabinoid receptors. And the system also has its own molecules that the body and the brain make, which are kind of similar to THC. We call them endocannabinoids. The best analogies, they're kind of like endorphins, but for cannabis, in the sense that it's a molecule similar to THC, but it's one the body makes. It acts on the same receptor. Doesn't do exactly the same thing, but kind of regulates a lot of the same biological processes that are affected by THC. So historically, for kind of last 20 years, I guess, a bit more maybe, since I was a student, I've been studying endocannabinoids and how they regulate stress-responsive brain circuits. And so when we get stressed out, like a lot of the neurons in these part of the brains kind of make endocannabinoids that then act as a feedback circuit to kind of turn them off and help bring back down to baseline levels and reduce feelings of stress and anxiety. So it's a big part of the recovery process from stress, is a lot of what we've worked out. And then we've kind of taken that and worked with a lot of clinical collaborators and psychiatrists and moved up the chain to try and study this in humans, and found, again, similarly, endocannabinoids are kind of really important in regulating stress and anxiety in humans. And that's kind of pushed us to the point where we've now started looking at if drugs that boost endocannabinoids might be novel therapeutic options to treat things like post-traumatic stress disorder or social anxiety disorder. And then kind of more in the last few years, since legalization has happened in Canada, we've also started studying cannabis more in the lab. And so we've really been more interested in kind of honing in on some of the neurodevelopmental effects of cannabis. So what happens during gestational exposure or during adolescence. And then we've also really done a lot of focus on we've tried to understand like the brain circuitry of the munchies. So, when someone or an animal or a human gets stoned and they like start wanting to eat a lot of kind of palatable, sweet, tasty food. Why is that happening? How are the brain circuits getting activated to drive that behavior? So that's kind of a large picture of what we do.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for mentioning that. One thing that I wanted to ask you about there, I think that was worth mentioning, is when you say endocannabinoids, like a lot of people are unaware that we do have, cannabinoids within our own system. And so like when we have this stress response, are you indicating then that like if someone, they're not smoking cannabis or just regular person, not that you're not a regular person if you smoke cannabis, but you're just a person who's not using cannabis, and you get stressed, you will then generate endocannabinoids in your system upon that stress response. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, everyone kind of always is making endocannabinoids all the time to some degree. They're really important in regulating, basal levels of excitability in the brain and kind of keeping things where they should be. They're really important for homeostasis. But yeah, there are some things that can cause boosts in endocannabinoids so that they do a bit more of some heavy duty work, and stress is one of them. So we know that like when we get stressed, there's a cascade of hormones, which results in humans, it's cortisol, and rodents, it's corticosterone. But when that cortisol levels go up from stress, the cortisol will then act on the receptors that it binds to, and that triggers endocannabinoid synthesis. So stress hormones cause this cloud of endocannabinoids to get made, and that's part of a feedback loop that then helps turn off the stress response and bring everything back down to normal. So yeah, regardless of whether someone has used cannabis or not, endocannabinoids are really important for kind of stress feedback and stress recovery and stress adaptation.
Very, very interesting. And we'll talk maybe more about, certain cannabinoids and how they do impact stress. But one thing that I really wanted to ask you about, and I'm sure you've been asked this a lot since the Andrew Huberman podcast, but the relationship that CBD has with caffeine. I think that some people, if you're laughing, you're probably like, yeah, that's the thing I've been asked about the most since, but it's just so interesting, and because it affects so many people, right? Like I'm drinking coffee here right now with some caffeine in it, right? And so my kind of cutoff usually is like 2 to 3 p.m. I usually don't have any more caffeine. And so for CBD, a lot of people were thinking that it has like a similar effect that caffeine has, and that we shouldn't be using it close to bed. This was, again, not everybody, but some people had this school of thought. And when you were on the Huberman Lab podcast, you basically said it's like anti-caffeine. And so maybe you could explain that mechanism, and you can get as detailed as possible, because I think people are like super interested in this particular mechanism.
I mean, CBD has like a lot of potential biological mechanisms because it's just a very dirty molecule. It seems to interact with a ton of things. But the one I talked about on Huberman that from my scientific perspective, I feel like probably makes the most sense when we think of what a lot of the effects of CBD are. And also, importantly, in the dose range, it's because the caffeine and CBD both affect something called the adenosine system. And so a lot of the effects that people have found of CBD in biological systems, you really need like massively high doses of CBD to hit that. And so it's kind of like, sure, maybe if you're like mega dosing, you would be getting those effects, but at kind of lower doses, there's got to be some biological mechanism that would make sense. And so normally, adenosine is a neurotransmitter that's somewhat of an inhibitory transmitter, I guess you could say, because we know it does things like promote sleep, and it's sedating to some degree. And so caffeine, one of the main ways that caffeine acts is it blocks adenosine receptors. So it's kind of like an adenosine antagonist, and it reduces the effects of adenosine. And I mean, it also will trigger adrenaline and other catecholamines, but that's one of the reasons why caffeine is so alerting. Like it makes people aroused and alert and kind of wakes them up, is partly because it's blocking adenosine receptors. CBD on the other side of this seems to block. So basically, once adenosine gets released, it's released into the synapse, it acts on its receptors, and that's kind of, let's say, the sleep promoting and sedating effects of it. So caffeine's right there at the receptor blocking that. But once adenosine has done its thing, it's got to get pulled out of the synapse and cleared away. And this is kind of the normal life cycle of neurotransmitters. And so there's a transporter that's like a protein that will essentially suck adenosine out of the synapse and therefore terminate its signaling abilities, and that will reduce its ability to continue doing its thing, like promoting sleep and relaxation. And so CBD actually, C.C. Hillard's lab, like 20 years almost ago now, found that CBD blocks that transport mechanism. And so what that causes is an accumulation of adenosine in the synapse. And so you get more and more adenosine acting at its receptors, and that would, in theory then, or at least it could result in more things like relaxation. The original paper from CC's lab did also show that that was involved in some of the anti-inflammatory effects of CBD. So the biology can be a lot. So I always just kind of say, it's like the opposite of caffeine. Like we said on Huberman, it's like anti-caffeine. Now, that being said, no one's really done that study in humans, because really it would be interesting to see if you dosed people with CBD and had some outcome like arousal levels or sleepiness, and then gave them caffeine to see if you'd actually tease out a direct interaction that would likely be driven through the adenosine system. I don't think anyone's done that, but certainly in the animal literature, there's been a fair amount of follow-up on that, and it does seem like CBD does exert at least a good chunk of its effects through enhancing adenosine signaling.
Very, very interesting. And so that kind of brings me, I think, to my next question that a lot of people would probably want to ask would be, so what would happen if you took both of them at the same time? And I imagine that you would get, effects of both of them, but maybe slightly, I don't even know if it's counteracting effects, but it may actually decrease some of like the jitterness or the unpleasant effects that some people get. Any evidence or any even anecdotal evidence or like hypotheticals as to what would happen if you ingest CBD and caffeine at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, At a basic sense, I would predict they'd somewhat cancel each other out. And so, like, yeah, if you get jittery and kind of alert from caffeine and coffee, if you have a hit, like a decent dose of CBD that produces enough to cause an adenosine response, that would possibly mitigate that to some degree. And similarly, if there was some reason you were taking CBD, like, to reduce arousal and try and go to sleep, obviously taking caffeine would probably disrupt that. But again, caffeine would probably, like you're saying, do that in and of itself anyway. So it might be hard to necessarily tease that out. Maybe caffeine wouldn't be quite as alerting or arousing if someone had taken a bunch of CBD, but I guess it depends on the exact endpoints. Because again, CBD and caffeine will all have these other targets. Like, I mean, caffeine will still, increase adrenaline release and affect that. So that could still have arousing effects independent of its actions at adenosine. But that would be my guess. I mean, I think that they would to some degree cancel each other out.
Okay. I'm only going to ask you one more question about this topic, and then I promise I'll move on. But if, would someone say, if someone says, I stopped drinking coffee at 12 o'clock because, I don't sleep well at night if I have it any later, but I would like to have another cup at like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock so I could be more productive. Like, could they, I don't want to use the term biohack, but could they have that extra coffee and then potentially have more CBD in the evening time, and then they would get the benefit of the coffee during the time where they needed more energy, and then potentially, get the sedating effect of the CBD that would cancel it out. Is there a world where you could see that could work in any ways, or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would depend on the dose of CBD, and I guess it would depend on, a lot of people I don't think find CBD sedating. I think there are definitely people that use it for sleep. And so if you're someone who seems to benefit from sleep from it, then I would imagine that would help counter the arousing effects of having coffee. I mean, I agree. I kind of feel like most people I know, there's some people who seem to not respond to coffee and they can drink it after dinner and they're fine. But yeah, I think usually people will cut it around what you're saying, 2 o'clock. So most of it should also have flushed out of your system by that point. But if there is some residual jitteriness, because some people are super sensitive to caffeine, then maybe taking a hefty dose of CBD later on would help counter that and take you down a bit.
Yeah, that'd be a cool thing to kind of study,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are interested in this.
Yeah, I was going to say there's so many interesting things like this to study, and the challenging thing that comes out of it is how would you get this thing I was trying to say to people? They're like, well, why don't we know that? And I'm like, well, who would pay for it? Because that's the thing. It's we kind of thought with legalization that a lot of the cannabis companies initially seemed to be very interested in research and actually promoting this kind of science where they'd want to know more stuff. And pretty rapidly they peeled back and seemed to not care, because they were selling cannabis regardless of whether they answered questions like this. But a lot of this stuff doesn't fall under the umbrella of health related stuff. So it's hard to get funding to run studies like this, because most of the studies, if we're talking about cannabis stuff, that are going to get funded are either clinical trials to try and understand if there's medical benefit of cannabis for various conditions, or understanding the harms of cannabis in the context of adolescence or prenatal or some of these other situations where you have adverse effects of cannabis. It's very hard to just study, the cool shit of cannabis that's interesting, what does it interact with and things like that, because these just don't fall under the umbrella of normal things that get funded. And because cannabis companies don't care, it seems, they're just not putting money into it. So these are all of them speculative.
Yeah, seems like their focus, I guess, more. Not that they shouldn't be focused, on medical patients, but it would be cool to kind of study some of these other things that we're discussing today, just to understand how it does interact with other molecules, because obviously people use other molecules other than CBD, and, caffeine obviously being one of the more popular ones. But coming back to CBD, so, I was really happy that you said this on the Hoopman podcast again, when you guys were talking about CBD dose, because this comes up all the time. You'll have a patient come in and sometimes even bring in a paper and they'll say man, people are getting 300 milligrams of CBD in this. How am I going to get any benefit at all from 10 to 20 milligrams? And again, I've seen it in my practice. I'm sure you've seen it with your friends or maybe experienced it yourself. If you take 20 milligrams of CBD or 40 milligrams of CBD, generally people can feel like something. Like, is it a little subtle? Yeah, it's going to be subtle for a lot of people. For some people, though, if you have a lot of anxiety, actually it could be, quite dramatic overall. But in terms of like the dose, why was 300 milligrams used so much and seemed to be repeated so much? And are we seeing more studies now that are using more like 20 milligrams or around that range? And again, some of it just comes down to like economics, because, people have a lot of trouble affording cannabis just as it is. And so, a 300 milligram dose, I mean, no one can really afford that. So, do we see more studies being done in like reasonable or practical doses, or are we still seeing more with like this 300 milligrams at one time?
I would actually say 300 megs is on the lower side for a lot of the clinical stuff. There are studies that have been done with the lower doses. The problem is, and this is one of the reasons why I was like heavy on the expectancy bias stuff on Huberman. And it's just kind of one of the things that a lot of us in the field generally think, and I mean, if Ziva's coming on, I'm sure Ziva will talk about this as well. Most of the actual blinded studies where, you blind people so no one actually knows what they're getting, if they're getting placebo or CBD, that are in the lower range, most of those haven't shown significant outcomes. And so it's hard. Now, granted, you always do have big placebo responses. Even to an inert placebo that you give someone, people will respond to it. The problem with CBD that I've encountered a lot is, and again, you can't take away from personal experience. And so that's the thing. I always say to people, if you're taking it and it's working for you, keep taking it. Because there are some people that do seem to respond. I mean, Stacy Gruber, I'd say, is the one person I can think of who's done some work. She's done at the McLean at Harvard, and she's done some stuff with like, it's some kind of CBD formulation, but I think it's around 20 to 30 mgs of CBD a day. So it's the doses you're talking about. And she has seen some effects from them. I've seen her present it. I haven't seen it published, so I don't know all the details in and out. But that's kind of the one larger study that I'm aware of that has used doses in that range that has found effects. Typically at doses like that, the trials tend to be negative. And so with the blinding, like doing a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, I think the reason why more people are moving to the 300 to 600 milligram range, which is kind of more like the medical side, like I think that seems to be the dosing. I mean, if you go to the pediatric epilepsy studies, like I said this on Huberman too, it's like, I mean, some of those doses, some of those kids are getting over around 2,000 mgs of CBD a day. Like it's whopping doses. And so there has never been a proper study that has looked at a minimum effective dose, which is what we would do with almost all other medications. Like we would do dose curves and try and understand what's the upper bracket of where we should be in terms of having benefit without having adverse effects. But more importantly, you want to know what the lower bracket is. Because for most other medications that exist, like ibuprofen or anything, there's like a fixed dose that you just, everyone takes like 200 mgs or 400 mgs of ibuprofen if they're trying to bring down inflammation. And we don't have that information for CBD. Most of the studies that have been done, like I was saying, we have kind of these upper brackets that we've been used in the pediatric epilepsy studies that are closer to 2,000 mgs. So they're really high doses. And we haven't tested the range of dosing like we normally do for drugs. So we don't know what the upper bracket is. We don't know, more importantly, what the lower minimum effective dose is. And a lot of that has created problems because most of this has really been started by the epilepsy field. And so they were kind of shooting in the dark and they had no idea. And what they found was that there didn't really seem to be a standardized dose. And that was a bit of an issue for a medicine. This is one of the things that has actually made it really challenging for CBD getting normalized, is that like we were saying, for a lot of medicines like Advil or something, you have fixed doses that you take. But with CBD, when they were looking at the epilepsy studies, they would tend to let people scale. So they would start them at like 5 mgs per kg or something. I think that was the low end dose. And then they would let them increase it until they started to see effects, and then they would kind of stabilize there. And so by doing that, you would get some people that would stop at 5 mgs per kg, which, and these are kids. So that could be something as low as like 100 mgs if you have like a 20 kilo kid. But that could also go up quite substantially, depending on the size of the person, depending on the dose. And so the highest I think that they ever went to was 25 mgs per kg, which again, if you're talking about, someone like you or me, that's probably around 2,000 milligrams. And so it can get like to a whopping dose.
Like, because people are taking 25 milligrams like total. You're saying 25 milligrams per kilogram, just to put that in like perspective. So sorry, go ahead there, Matt.
Yeah, no. And I mean, this is one of the big disconnects that we've seen between like what we say is like CBD in the clinic and CBD in the wild is that, and I mean, I have talked to a lot of physicians about this as well, because there was like a Delphi kind of thing that was written by a group of physicians in Canada a few years ago, and they were talking about doses in the range that you're talking about. And so I've talked to them as well to be like, trying to understand the rationale behind that, because I'm like, I know a lot of people take this and claim benefit from it, but I'm like, we don't have a lot of actual clinical evidence to show that doses at that range do something. And they said kind of the economy aspect was a big part of this, because they said, well, first of all, there are a lot of people who self-report benefit from doses at this level, but, we can't say, you should go start with 300 milligrams because, for most people, that's like a couple $100 a day. So it becomes just prohibitive. Like, it's just not financially reasonable in any capacity for people to be able to do that. So I think that's where a lot of this started from. But really, and again, this is kind of one of the things that we really need a lot more research and funding in the area for, is we need to do a scaled kind of blinded trial with like a whole bunch of different doses. So we know, part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, to do it at like 300 milligrams, but have another group at like 100 milligrams, and have another group at like, 50, maybe another at 20, like something like that, like several different groups, and see if there is like some kind of, dose dependent response effect.
Yeah. And that's something I think we need to figure out for sure. I think we also need to improve the bioavailability. And I think this varies depending on how people take it. So obviously, if there's inhalation, which is really rare with CBD, it does not seem like many people kind of do inhaled versions of CBD. Most people do oral versions or some version of that, like sublingual. So we know that if you inhale it, it has really good bioavailability, as anything does, because there's not a lot of filtering out at that point. It kind of goes through the lungs and right into the blood. But when you take it orally, CBD is really poor. It has really bad bioavailability. It doesn't leave the gut very easily. And so the original studies from GW, who made Epidiolex, which was the CBD formulation they used for all the original pediatric epilepsy studies, their initial studies predicted it was only about 4% that got out of the gut. They did find if you preloaded someone with a fatty meal and then they took CBD, it enhanced the bioavailability quite a bit, so like up to maybe 20%. But the issue,
I was going to say, I read something recently that said that it increases it by 4 times, which would go basically exactly with the data that you just said, because you just said 4 to 5 milligrams and then to 20. So that would be, roughly 4 times,
So it's about, it seems you get a lot more in the blood that way. And it's probably just because CBD is a fatty molecule. So it needs fat to slide to get out of the gut into the blood. It's kind of the opposite of alcohol, where like usually if you have a full stomach, it absorbs the alcohol, so less of it gets in the blood. But for CBD, the fattiness in the stomach definitely seems to need that facilitates its transport out. So that's, I always say to people, like, if you're going to do, like, especially if people take CBD at night, like, eat something a little like fatty beforehand, just to facilitate its bioavailability a bit more. But and that's one of the other reasons why the low dose stuff is hard to reconcile mechanistically, because you're just like, I'm not sure how much of it is actually getting out into the bloodstream, especially at those low doses. And if it is, I've talked to a lot of the people that have done the pharmacokinetic work, and they say, you can definitely start seeing CBD in the blood around kind of 25-ish mgs is where you're getting levels in the blood that could start, maybe hitting something pharmacological target. But again, I feel like if you're talking about someone who has like IBS, then it's a different story, because you're going to get a lot of CBD localized inside the actual GI tract. So it could bring down inflammation and effects there. But it's a bit of I don't know how else to say it outside. It's a bit of a Wild West because we've been so overrun by personal experience and anecdotal reports that it creates this difficulty in actually understanding what's real, because there's just so much promotion of CBD without us really understanding the biology of it as well. And so I think that's why a lot of the people who are in the kind of cannabinoid science space are always a little reluctant to really take firm positions on CBD. And then I think you get kind of inundated by the overwhelming like CBD smoothie and CBD hand cream and CBD hair
everything.
It's just like, okay, now this just feels a little ridiculous at this point in terms of like what is actually happening. So, I think there's been kind of the whole like hype curve where it's like, oh, it does everything, and then it's like the reality of what it really does. And I do think that CBD has definitely some potential benefit. There are things I think obviously epilepsy is very clear. The data on that's very strong, but again, that's mega dosing. But yeah, I think we need to get a bit more understanding of even doing sublingual versus oral oils, because that is definitely producing different effects.
Yeah, it's really important though. Like the fatty acid thing is massive. Like to get 4 times more absorption, I mean, that is just dramatic, So I think that for people who are using CBD and sometimes they feel like it works and sometimes they feel like it don't work, that it doesn't work, like that could absolutely be because of what you ate, prior to using the CBD. And so, just a really, really important point for patients and people who are listening to this. So I really appreciate you bringing up that point. There's one thing too that I wanted to ask you about, again related to the Huberman podcast. And I looked this up after too, and honestly, it taught me something. So you were mentioning in the podcast that sometimes CBD, you were talking about CBD and THC and their relationship with each other, and you said that sometimes actually CBD could even potentiate the effects of THC. And I was like, wow. I was like, I've never really heard of that before. I was sort of like embarrassed, And then I went online on PubMed and I was like, holy shit, like it's true. Like there's a couple studies here that show this. And so, that kind of throws a wrench into everything. So if you can, and again, maybe this is something that requires like, a very long explanation, but if you can, what is the relationship with THC and CBD, and how do they affect one another?
Well, there's a few ways this works. In the plant, the two molecules kind of come from the same precursor. So this is why we always say, like, if you, as cannabis has been bred to be high in THC, which is virtually all street cannabis, because that's just what people want. They want the THC. And so as cannabis was bred for THC, because it's the same molecule that makes either THC or CBD. It's the enzyme that determines which path it goes down. So you breed the plant to have the enzyme to make that THC, not CBD. And so by default, CBD has largely been bred out of cannabis unless someone's intentionally trying to make a plant rich in CBD. So you already have this kind of yin-yang relationship that exists in the plant where more THC is less CBD, and the inverse is true as well. So that's the beginning of the whole thing. So whenever people get this kind of mixed chemovar ratios where it's kind of like a 12% THC and a 12% CBD, they tend to like those better. And a lot of people attribute that to the CBD, but sometimes it's just because there's lower THC in it. So there's the kind of that level at the plant where the two molecules interact. But then in the body, it's not really clear. There was kind of the whole idea that CBD countered THC really started from like a public speaking study that was done, I think in the 70s in Brazil. And they basically dosed people with CBD before giving them like an oral dose of THC and then making them do public speaking. And the THC would trigger a bit of an anxiety attack in people doing public speaking. And if they'd been given CBD in a tandem with it, it seemed to counter it to some degree. And so this kind of like fueled this whole area, that this idea that CBD counters THC. And some of the rodent research that came in the like years and years after this, some of it supported it. It was often giving like very high doses of CBD through injection. So bioavailability is no longer an issue because everything gets in the system. And at those levels, maybe CBD is countering some aspects of THC because there is some possible interactions at the CB1 receptor where CBD could be a negative allosteric modulator and kind of inhibit the ability of THC to bind and produce signaling. But that doesn't seem to be the typical response. And what they found more recently is, and this is usually on the background of higher CBD and lower THC. And the reason that's the case is because that's usually more the medical application. Like anyone who's getting a CBD tincture or CBD oil, it always has THC in it. It's just usually very low levels of THC. Now, those low levels of THC can become relevant very quickly, depending on the individual and how experienced they are with THC, because the ratio is usually like somewhere like 20 to 1. So if you're taking 20 mgs of CBD, then you're taking 1 mg of THC. 1 mg of THC probably doesn't do a lot. But let's say you're taking 80 mgs of CBD. Now you've got 4 mgs of THC. And what we know is that the enzyme that metabolizes THC can get saturated by CBD. And so what happens is, as you start taking more CBD, the CBD can start filling in those enzymes, and that prevents THC from being broken down. So then THC starts accumulating. And so something that was 4 mgs, which maybe wouldn't normally affect someone, can suddenly become potentiated, and then they can start feeling more high off of it. And that's a lot of the stuff that like Ryan Vandre, whose studies were a lot of the ones that found that down at Hopkins, they had done that where they were giving fixed doses of CBD and fixed doses of THC, and basically finding that you could amplify when you do these scales of how high someone is. People were reporting greater levels of intoxication on a fixed level of THC if they had a bunch of CBD in their system already. And a lot of this seems to be the metabolism. It just more CBD in the system seems to slow down THC metabolism. And therefore, as a consequence, you get this kind of amplified THC response. So in that sense, whatever this idea that CBD is counteracting THC doesn't seem to hold, because I'd say more of the recent data that's been done in very controlled manners actually suggests the opposite, that CBD might be enhancing some of the effects of THC. And I mean, honestly, this is what a lot of us generally think in the field when people do self-report effects of CBD. We're like, sure, some of it could be the CBD, but there is also trace levels of THC in there. And if it's someone who's really very cannabis naive and hasn't consumed a lot, even a couple of milligrams of THC can have like significant effects. And if the CBD is even moderately potentiating that, then I could certainly see that driving some of the effects. And it may not feel like they're getting full-blown high because it's not that high of a dose of THC, but it's enough for them to feel something. And it's just, I mean, I'm not aware of any CBD you can get commercially in Canada, at least, that is pure, that has nothing else in it, because everything's an extract. So there's always some THC that's in there.
Very, very interesting. And I think a lot of people, would want to know the answer to that question. So thanks so much for explaining that to us. In terms of, doses and other cannabinoids, so I know that Ziva actually produced a paper recently, and it was on CBG or cannabigerol. And so I'm okay to talk about this now. In the past, I mostly just talked about THC and CBD because a lot of the other cannabinoids were not commercially available. So it's just kind of annoying for other people to hear. Yeah. But now, people can actually obtain CBG fairly easily through the medical system or even not through the medical system. And so Ziva did a paper on CBG, and I think there was actually 20 milligrams of CBD in it as well. I think it was a 1-to-1 ratio of 20 milligrams of CBD and 20 milligrams of CBG. And I think they, yeah. Okay. And I think that they did find some positive findings in the study. It was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Only came out maybe like a month ago or something like that.
Yeah, it was pretty recent.
And so, I was really happy to see that, that a dose was used that's practical. And obviously I was very happy to see that, the result also was really positive. And so, we've talked a lot about THC and CBD today. Is there anything you can tell us about CBG, considering that it's now, commercially available and has exceptionally limited, but some, studies on it?
Yeah, well, Not really. Like biologically, we just don't. I mean, it doesn't bind to CB1. I'd say we know that. So it's not like THC. Whatever its biological mechanism is still a bit of a mystery. No one's figured out. And again, it's kind of like you're saying, it's just not been studied. Like really, CBD and THC have been the focus of almost all cannabinoid research, I would say, for the last 4 or 5 decades, essentially. So we know a lot more about them than anything else. I think a lot of this was spurred by the fact that people, I mean, when you look at analytics of cannabis, there are some strains that do have appreciable levels of CBG in them. And there were a lot of people that were kind of self-reporting that they found those strains to be more stress reducing. And so that, I think, was part of the reason why Ziva and Carey did the study they did, was just to try and suss out, do they actually see any effects on stress or anxiety? And I think they also had some memory stuff in there as well. And yeah, I mean, it's good because it's not intoxicating. Like CBD is not intoxicating like THC is, and CBG is like CBD like that. It does actually make it amenable to doing these well done blinded studies, because if someone gets high on THC, it's kind of hard to blind them because they're, I mean, as we all just learned in the MDMA issues that came out through the FDA, this is a challenge for all psychoactive drugs that create an intoxicated state. Is it's just very difficult to provide proper blinding, but CBG you can do this with. So the fact that they were able to get these effects that weren't massive, but they were there, is still pretty impressive and interesting. And I do think it says something about what CBG could be doing. So that's really, really cool. And I mean, I do like that Ziva does try and keep these things in those dose ranges. I mean, I know she's also doing some stuff with beta caryophylline, which is one of the terpenes that's in a lot of cannabis. And from talking to her about that, I'm pretty sure she's also intentionally kept the dosing of beta caryophylline that they're giving people at kind of like the upper bracket of what you would find in cannabis. So it is somewhat relevant in the sense that, okay, if you had a beta caryophylline rich strain of cannabis, you could possibly see some of these effects.
Okay. And for people who don't know what beta caryophylline is, can you just explain that briefly?
I mean, so like terpenes, which are in cannabis, are basically, they're kind of volatile chemicals that give the flavor and the smell to cannabis. They're not unique to cannabis. They're in a lot of other plants as well. So, you know, this is like limonene is what gives some strains of cannabis the citrusy odor and flavor it has. Pinene gives it kind of the woodsy one, and beta caryophylline is kind of peppery. I don't know. Like I've never actually tried beta caryophylline in isolation. Like Ziva has it in vape pens, so I think you can taste it, and it would probably have a distinct smell because it is a volatile terpene, but I actually don't know what it would smell or taste like. But it's just one of these molecules that's in cannabis. And so terpene profiles vary a lot. And a lot of what people, I mean, you've had Ethan on the show, so I'm sure he's talked about the entourage effect, but a lot of what most people believe mediates the entourage effect of cannabis is that you have THC, and that's the main intoxicating component, but the effects of that get moderated by these other molecules, mostly terpenes or minor cannabinoids like CBG, which would be present in the cannabis as well. And that can, you know, that in theory is why some people say some strains of cannabis are much more anti-anxiety, or some are more alerting, or some are more, you know, promote the munchies. So, I mean, there's a lot of, these are very hard to suss out, again, as to what is folklore and just anecdotal opinion versus reality. Because again, we've never had a single study that's ever been done blinded comparing like a sativa to an indica, or some cannabis that has this terpene profile to some cannabis that has this terpene profile. So we really, I mean, it's just speculative. We have no idea. We can't really make any claims about this because there's just no science behind it.
Yeah, no, it's hopefully, you know, the work that Ziva does can, you know, tease out some of that stuff, and we can figure out, you know, why certain people have certain reactions to certain strains. And, you know, maybe we'll find out that, you know, terpenes are, you know, very responsible. Maybe sometimes they're, you know, not responsible at all. And, you know, maybe a little bit in between. I guess time will just tell. One other cannabinoid that I did want to ask you about today, and unfortunately this one is not commercially available yet, but the research, just one study anyway, looked very, very interesting. So THCV, and you know, there's a study done in 2016. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's double-blind randomized control trials where they gave it, I believe it was either type 1 or type 2 diabetics, and virtually like everything improved, including like having to use, I believe, maybe even less insulin, but improved hemoglobin A1Cs and improved blood sugar control, improved, pancreatic beta cell function, to help produce insulin. And so, it seems like it was a potent molecule that had one really good double-blind study done on it. And then since then, I haven't really found too much on the internet. If you go on PubMed and put THCV in, the publication dates on the first page are going to be in mostly in the recent years, but very, very quickly, you'll see that there's very few publications on it at all. And so why isn't this being isolated? Because it's so confusing, because you look at something like Ozempic, which, I don't know, I heard a stat the other day that 30% of Americans are going to be on it within 5 years or something crazy like that. Why hasn't THCV been isolated? And do you think that it has, potential to be an effective cannabinoid?
I don't know a lot about THCV. What I do know, at least from the pharmacology, I remember when it first started getting attention a few years ago, it seemed, if I remember correctly, to be actually a cannabinoid receptor antagonist. So it was kind of the opposite of what THC is. THC is an agonist that activates cannabinoid receptors, and I think THCV might block the receptors. Or it has some inhibitory effect on the receptors. I can't remember the pharmacology of it, again, because like you're saying, I don't know why it hasn't had the attention to it, but that tends to, I definitely seen things here and there come up at the cannabinoid meetings I've been at. I don't know how much of that has made it to publication yet, that there are kind of some random groups that are studying this in different contexts, but maybe it's just not study that much, because I think it might be a cannabinoid that's pretty sparsely found in cannabis. And so it's not, in terms of even harvesting it and making it from a medical standpoint, I'm not sure. I know they've kind of figured out ways to get yeast to make CBD and stuff so they can start creating higher, more abundant production of this, just because it's so challenging to do all the extractions from plants and there's so much waste that happens. So I don't know if that's part of what it is. I remember talking to someone about this years ago, and they were saying it's really hard to find any strains of cannabis that actually have appreciable level of THCV.
Durban poison was 1.5%, and that was the highest I think anyone could find at the time, something like that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I remember years ago, and 1.5% is nothing, right? It's most people, if they smoked 1.5% even THC, they may not even feel too much of an effect. If you're naive, you will, but it's such a low dose. So even if it was found in a strain like Durban poison, that amount is not going to have an appreciable effect at all. So hopefully they can, isolate it and make it, commercially available and potentially do more studies on it. Because, again, it's just one study, but it is very, very interesting, just because it did show it to be effective in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And we have this, massive issue with obesity and weight gain in North America, and I guess all over the world right now. So you'd think that THCV would be something that people would probably be looking into a little bit more.
Yeah, it is also interesting. There have been 2 or 3 really large scale studies that have been done in North America that have found, independent of THCV, that just in general, cannabis users have lower rates of obesity. They have lower rates of diabetes. They have better glucose handling. It's kind of again, it's not clear. The causality in these things is very hard to establish. And so it's certainly possible that one of the main interpretations of it is that a lot of people that just choose to live a healthier lifestyle often choose cannabis as their drug of choice as opposed to alcohol. And so there might be associations that emerge because of that. But my colleague here in Calgary, Keith Sharkey, did do a study after these studies started coming out where they kind of made mice obese on high-fat diet and then started giving them THC, and they did lose weight. And it did track with changes in gut microbiome. So it was, again, kind of one of these things that people are always like, what? Because THC causes the munchies, and so many people think that it makes you overeat, but it actually doesn't in the long run. And I remember talking to Elise Weirtz, who's down at Hopkins, and she was doing a lot of the PET studies looking at cannabinoid receptor density in the brain. And so to do those, you have to inject people with a radio tracer that's going to bind to the cannabinoid receptors so they can visualize the radiation emission and get an idea of how many receptors there are in the brain. And she was saying in every study they ran, their cannabis using group always was leaner and had less rates of obesity than their control group. And they would have to adjust the amount of drug they were giving to compensate for the size difference of the people. And so there is just something else out there, I mean, independent of THCV, that just, I mean, whether it's an effective cannabis or it's just cannabis tracks with certain lifestyle choices in people that tend to be less obese. But it has been replicated a couple of times. So it does seem to be a thing.
I mean, the last time it will be a few years now since last time I looked, but I remember there was like 9 different studies at the time. I think it was in like 2018 that had looked at BMI, and every single one either found statistical significance or non-statistical significance in cannabis users having a lower BMI, a lower body mass index. So there's something up to it. Is it like healthy user bias? Like, I don't know. I just don't quite buy it. Like the same with like the sauna argument too, that it could be healthy user bias. I think there's some effects that are happening with the cannabinoid system, and same with the sauna. I think there's some good, vascular effects that are happening there. They may not be super pronounced, but there's definitely enough where there's like a signal that I'm confident that I think there's, something going on here, and definitely something that we should investigate a little bit further, considering again that, we do have this, massive obesity problem. I know I only got you for another, 10 or 15 minutes there, Matt. So just wanted to ask a couple more questions. So you and I, both understand that cannabis has benefits, but, unfortunately, sometimes it can have, detrimental effects as well. And so some people can have this, dependency on THC. And, fortunately, dependency on THC is nothing like, a dependency, say, on like opioids or something like that. That's why we don't have, very many like cannabis, withdrawal centers versus say opioid centers, because most people, again, I'm not saying it's easy, but many people are able to, eliminate THC use without, medical help. But that being said, maybe everyone can't. And, say if someone is listening to this and they feel like they're using too much THC, they're too dependent on it, they need to use it, every hour of every day. And if they don't have it, they become very irritable and they say enough is enough. I want to at least reduce this, where if I don't have some cannabis, I'm not, so irritable. What would be the best piece of advice you could give to someone like that?
I mean, kind of like what you're saying, actually, is what I would usually say to someone. Like, I'm big on harm reduction approaches. So, if someone can go abstinent, great. That's obviously the goal they want to get to. Cannabis, yeah. So like you said, the dependency with cannabis is not the same as it is with alcohol or opiates. And the withdrawal is a thing, but it's not the same. I mean, cannabis withdrawal is probably more akin to caffeine withdrawal. There's a lot of irritability. There's some mood changes. There's definitely some sleep disturbances. I think the single most reliable thing people report is this, like, these rebound nightmares that become really intense. Because, there's some effects of cannabis to suppress REM to some degree. So people tend to dream less when they're using cannabis. And when they stop, they have these really intense, vivid dreams. And so that's, if someone can go full abstinent, if that's what they are wanting to do, then great, all the power to them to do it. A lot of people struggle with that. And it's more often what happens is when people try and go off cannabis, they keep relapsing because, again, like you're saying, they find they're too irritable, they're too moody, they can't sleep properly. So they keep relapsing and going back. I always say to someone, like, if they're like what you're saying, like if they're a wake and baker, so if you're getting up and kind of using cannabis morning to night, and you don't like how it makes you feel and you want to, use less, and, some people think the only way to go is to stop using a drug entirely. And again, that's certainly one approach if you can get there, but I'm much bigger of a fan of, like, can you just scale it back? And so
yeah, I agree.
I feel like the first thing I try to say to people is, I'm like, well, it's a journey to get there, as it is with any substance that you have some use issues with. And so I think the first thing to do is to just try and prolong use to later in the day. Like, that's usually, the first argument. We say the same thing to teenagers about smoking pot. It's like, if you can just delay starting as long as you can, like just you're going to reduce whatever potential harms could track with that. And I think, like, I mean, we definitely see a big difference in, and I always try and say this to people, like, the people I think are completely naive to cannabis in the cannabis world in any way, they don't understand the difference between someone that would say like smoke a joint at night before they go to bed versus someone that got up in the morning and smoked a joint throughout the whole, or smoke joints consecutively throughout the whole day, because they look at it, oh, is there a daily user? And if they use that phrase, they kind of equate the two to the same. But I'm always like, these are very, very different things. And we've done some studies with the rodents where we've used the vape chambers and we've tried to compare like once a day to multiple times a day, and we definitely see different effects emerge. So I'm always a big proponent of saying, like, more often than not, what people tend to use cannabis for, especially if they're using it frequently and almost daily, and it's not, let's say, under a medical capacity per se, is they're using it to help themselves sleep, or they're, trying to manage anxiety to some degree. So I always try to encourage people to say, okay, well, can you at least push your use to the later parts of the day? So you're not going to take away the fact that you find cannabis helps you sleep per se, but maybe just try and not smoking. You can start this by saying, let's not smoke before noon. And if you can get through a few weeks of doing that, then say, let's not smoke before 5. And if you can do that for a few days, move it back. Just push the needle progressively a little bit more at a time so that it doesn't really trigger any of the withdrawal syndrome. You don't get the irritability. And I think that it allows you to develop a bit more adaptation in your daily routine so that people can figure out how to manage themselves with certain things in the absence of using the drug. And I think if someone's capable of scaling it back to, a few days a week, or even limiting it to just night, if they're still maintaining daily, that's still better. In terms of
I agree.
reducing the risk of the harms of cannabis than someone who's going to wake up and smoke cannabis consecutively throughout the day. And so I think it's just a matter of figuring out what is a balance. And I mean, it's interesting because even in the cannabis dependency studies, like some of the stuff Ziva has been involved in, but like the ones Meg Haney and Cyril D'Souza and others down in the States have been running, the endpoint isn't pure abstinence. It's just reductions in use. And that's considered a win. If you can actually find an intervention that just reduces how frequently someone uses cannabis, and they usually do this objectively by like THC levels in the urine or their blood or something, as well as subjectively asking them how many times they consume a day. Even if it's not producing full abstinence, it's just reducing use. That's a win, because the more you scale back use, the more you're going to reduce the harms. And so I think that's probably the way to go. So I think it's a lot of people I know who've struggled with alcohol abuse. It's kind of all or none. You can't really play that game. At least some people might be able to, but a lot of people can't. It's like you got to be off entirely, because as soon as you start using, they escalate again. And so cannabis might be a little different in that sense, and that people might be able to maintain use at lower levels without going overboard. And so if they can scale back to that, that'd be, I'd say, still an improvement.
That's very, very interesting. And it's a cool point, actually. I've never kind of really thought about it in that way before. Like, many people, like you said, with alcohol, like you said, like, oh, if I have one drink, I have to have 12. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people are like that who are alcoholics. But with cannabis, sometimes like, okay, I just need one puff and then I'll be good for a few hours, and maybe, and then I'll have another puff. Like, I think that, it's sort of something that's, I don't want to say, I guess maybe you could say like it's easier to just gradually scale back. And I think the option of gradually scale back is more effective when you're trying to scale back on cannabis, as opposed to say when you're trying to scale back on alcohol. I think like, for a lot of people, it does have to be kind of like, all or none, unfortunately. And so, really, really good point there. There's one more thing that I wanted to ask you about. There's many more things. There's one thing I really wanted to ask you about. So vaping versus smoking, obviously people ask about this all the time. I don't think there's, unfortunately, a ton of, evidence that we have to formulate like a very, very, very hard concrete answer. But in terms of what you've seen, vaping versus smoking, I certainly, have mentioned to patients that I think that overall, vaping does cause less harm because, there's no combustion. But again, we do need more trials to kind of indicate exactly what's going on here. But what have you seen in your research, Matt?
So So I always try and distinguish between vaping an oil product versus vaping flower. And this was something I said on Huberman, because I said, when I talk to Americans, when they say vaping, they all think oil. Like, no one thinks of vaping flower. Whereas in Canada, because I think pre-legalization, when we had the medical system in place, things like volcanoes and vaporizers like that were somewhat common. And so a lot of people here understand that more. Now, there is a bit of work that's been done with things like volcanoes, where you use plant matter and you vaporize that so you don't get any of the plant combustion, but you're still getting the lift of the cannabinoids off. And the studies that have been done on that do demonstrate you don't have combustion byproducts. So people don't exhale carbon monoxide. They're not. So, I mean, some of the damage that goes from inhalation is obviously related to the combustion byproducts and the potential carcinogens that come out of that. So I think vaping plant matter is a much more kind of like using a harm reduction lens, a much better approach than smoking, because you are going to reduce the combustion byproducts and the potential harm that comes from that. I never know what to say about vaping oil products, because I just don't think we understand. I mean, I would imagine that there would probably be less harms associated with it than smoking, because again, you're still kind of doing a vaporization approach. But I think a lot of that's going to be dependent on what the chemical composition of the vehicle that they've extracted the cannabis with, how clean it is, what is produced when that vehicle combusts. Because, I mean, we knew because there is no regulation in the States, because it's not federalized at the legal level. And so the state by state legalization doesn't really mandate regulation in the same capacity that federal can. And so, I mean, some places just use, similar vehicles they use to nicotine, but the problem was that THC comes out of solution differently because it's a lipid, so it doesn't sit in it like nicotine does. So they've had to add other things, and there was at one point they had added vitamin E acetate, and that resulted in dozens of deaths, because when it combusts, even though it's like everyone knows it's a vitamin, it must be neutral and safe, but when it combusts, it created some massive irritant to lung tissue. And so all these people were getting these massive inflammatory responses in their lungs, and it resulted in a bunch of deaths. And so it's like, well, that obviously wasn't a safer route than smoking, because of the fact that it was kind of that had not been properly vetted and properly tested, and it was just kind of thrown into the mix. And so I'm just not familiar with I don't even know in Canada what is used for the extraction process or for the actual vehicle, if it's like a propylene glycol or it's a glycerin or something like they use for nicotine or some of those vapes in the States. So, and we just don't have any long-term health data in terms of what the byproducts of combusting those molecules could be. So I always say I'm much more comfortable comparing vaping plant matter to smoking plant matter than I am to commenting on anything with vaping oil-based products, because I think that I can confidently say that I think vaping plant matter is a safer and less harmful approach than smoking plant matter. And because you're not introducing another chemical entity into the mix by creating a solvent there's nothing new that's coming on board. So you're just scaling the harms down, because smoking obviously has the combustion byproducts. You don't get that with vaping the plant matter. So I think vaping plant matter would be, from an inhalation perspective, the kind of least harmful approach to go. And so whenever people have asked me, again, in medical context, that's usually what I would recommend, is saying, like, volcanoes are very expensive. There are other vaporizers that are a lot more affordable, that people can get access to, especially now in the legal market in Canada, that allow them to do vaporization with plant matter. So I think from a harm reduction perspective, that's definitely a better way to go.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering that. And we'll probably end things there, unfortunately. But yeah, just to kind of recap, it seems like, vaping dried product is probably the safest. Second safest, again, we don't really know for sure, but we probably think that, vaping oils is likely safer than smoking. But again, we're not completely sure about that. I could come back to you next year and, say something different if the research says that. So appreciate you, clearing that up. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before we leave? Anything else that you're working on, or anything at all?
I mean, I just say there is an organization in Canada called the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids, CCIC. I'm pretty sure you've actually come to the meetings before. It's like, I mean, the meetings are, they've scaled down a lot since COVID. Obviously, health priorities in Canada shift a lot. We still do have a lot of educational activities that are run. So the website, ccic.net, there's educational information on there. There's resources for different things relating to harm reduction, but also people want to learn more about different aspects of cannabis. We have some things posted on a YouTube channel, and there is like a learning module thing. So I always encourage people to kind of go that route. That was like a big educational thing that Ziva and myself and like 7 or 8 other scientists and physicians work together on to build. So it's pretty comprehensive. But yeah, I'd say that's probably it.
Awesome. And then definitely, I'm going to say again, check out Dr. Matthew Hill's podcast with Huberman Lab. It's longer than this one. It's 3 hours. They go into
4 hours.
Or 4 hours.
Yeah.
And they go into, some stuff in pretty good depth there. I wasn't able to cover everything today, but I did get a lot of the questions that I wanted to ask you, particularly about the CBD and the caffeine. So thanks so much for doing that. And thanks so much for coming on and for all the work that you do. And of course, thank you everyone for listening. And as always, I'll be back again soon.